The Western Desert is a place fit only for war. Thousands of square miles are nothing but sand and stone. A compass is as necessary, once off the road, as it is to a sailor at sea. Water doesn't exist until you bore deep into the earth. You bath in your shaving mug. Flies have the tenacity of bulldogs. Bruises readily turn to desert sores. Days that are very hot can be followed by nights of bitter cold. When the hot Khamsin wind brings its sandstorms, life can be intolerable. The Arabs say that after 5 days of it, murder can be excused. The tide of this war in the desert has ebbed and flowed. But as Rommel advanced after we lost Tobruk, never had our backs been so close to the Suez Wall. We had lost 80,000 men and much booty. There were earlier lines of defense on which General Auchinleck might have stood, Sidi Barrani or Mersa Matruh, for example. But he was deliberately falling back on El Alamein, no more than 60 miles from Alexandria. To Rommel, advancing at considerable speed, Egypt, with the Nile Delta which gives it life, Cairo, British General Headquarters and Africa's principal city, Alexandria, Egypt's chief port and base of our Mediterranean fleet, and Suez, gateway to the Far East. All these must have seemed dazzlingly near as a mirage, and as it proved, as much an illusion. It was a wise decision of General Auchinleck's to come back to El Alamein, much the strongest natural line of defense between the Libyan frontier and the Delta. Moreover, Rommel's lines of supply were here stretched to the limit. On the right, our flank rested on the sea. On the left, it approached the Qattara Depression, a trough the size of Wales, 1/3 of it salt marsh, and all of it territory that no vehicle can cross. On this 40 miles front, General Auchinleck took personal command. His the total responsibility. Not another yard back were we going. His much depleted army dug, blasted, and wired itself in, and laid protective mines. Our front was one of discontinuous belts of minefields with strong points, and machine gun and anti-tank gun emplacements. But it was as yet extremely slender. Here, General Auchinleck waited, and with him, men who had fought at Gazala and Sidi Rezeg, others who had been twice to Benghazi, others who had escaped from Bir Hakeim and Tobruk. The 8th Army had made a fighting retreat of 400 miles, and a battle which approached in its importance the Battle of Britain was now at hand. The Middle East, Suez, and infinitely more was at stake. The crucial days had come. Rhine held. After several days of attack and counterattack, the British, Australians, Indians, and South Africans were still there, fighting as dogged as our infantry at Waterloo. The immediate crisis was past, but anxiety remained. Into this situation stepped Mr. Churchill, bringing his own inspiration and vigor. He brought good news of reinforcements both in men and supplies which had already rounded the Cape. For 5 days he visited the Army and Air Force, explaining the task and its importance. And most dramatic of all, he brought new commanders, General Alexander and General Mongomery. Alexander, one of the last men out of Dunkirk, and whose small army withstood the Japanese the whole length of Burma, and Montgomery, who took over the 8th Army. A man who lives as sternly as a Cromwell, and who is as much a part of his modern Ironsides. Battles swallow up weapons faster than you can build them. At home in Britain, the machinery of war poured from the factories. And British women worked alongside men on the shells, the ships, the tanks, the aircraft, the explosives. In no country are women so thoroughly organized for war. In the United States, bigger and more powerful tanks were coming off the assembly line. The Shermans, for instance, with their 75mm guns and all-round Traverse, going to Egypt for the first time. Although American material used at El Alamein was but a small proportion of the whole, it was vital to our success. Army had the longest lines of supplies that the history of war has ever known. There are two main routes to the Middle East from Britain and America. The first by sea round the Cape, 12,000 miles menaced by U-boats, which nothing but the resolution of our merchant seamen and the Navy's guard over them has kept open. And the second by air across the middle of Africa, over the Niger, and then north along the Nile Valley. Landing grounds have been cut from the jungle. On this route fly aircraft brought by ship to ports on the west coast and there assembled. The work has its own problems, among them malaria. behind the line, great reinforcement. In the line, Rommel had come for us again. It was 2 months later. He told his troops that on this day they were going to Cairo. But 5 days afterwards, he withdrew. He left nearly 300 tanks behind to prove his generalship. In 2 or 3 months, we recreated and greatly enlarged the 8th Army. Into Middle East ports came men from the United Kingdom, India, and South Africa. The 44th Home Counties Division and the 51st Highlands Division had actually left Britain in May and June. And it was at the time Tobruk fell that President Roosevelt, who had Mr. Churchill with him at the time, ordered the first Sherman tanks to Egypt. Long-range planning was yielding its reward. The Air Force kept guard. Rommel, with a supply line 1/10 the length of ours, was himself building up his supplies as hard as he could go. But for a considerable proportion of them, there was no future. Our united air forces saw to that. Navy and Fleet Air Arm also were busy destroying Rommel's convoys. Within a few weeks, our Mediterranean submarines sank or damaged 24 enemy ships. In August alone, of all that was shipped to him, 80% went to the bottom. Meanwhile, the 8th are trained to the last ounce.
The physical fitness and hardness of an army is one of the biggest battle-winning factors in war. When two first-class fighters meet, he who sticks it longest wins in the end. This has been proved time and time again, and applies to all ranks, from general officers to private soldiers. And this includes all branches of the army, whatever their job, and wherever they be. Fighting fit and fit to fight.
Towards the middle of October, preparations on both sides were nearing completion. In the north, Rommel's forces stretched from the coast to a point 10 miles inland. Here were the bulk of his German infantry, comprising the 90th Light and the 164th Divisions, together with the Italian Trieste Division. In the south, holding a front of 14 miles, were 3 Italian divisions. These were strengthened by the rest of his German infantry. The center was left deliberately weak, held by a single Italian division, the Bologna, holding a front of 16 miles. Behind the infantry in the north were 2 armored divisions, 1 German and 1 Italian, and similarly in the south. The British line began in the north with the 9th Australians, and below them the 1st South Africans. The 51st Highland Division, who had some Valerie to avenge, and the 4th Indian Division, veterans of Abyssinia and the Western Desert, held the center. In the south were the 50th Division from the Tees and Tyne, with the fighting French of Bir Hakeim and contingents of Greeks. The tactical reserve was found by the 44th Division from counties close to London. Our armored divisions were 3, all United Kingdom men. Some veterans of a score of desert battles, others new to the work. 1 division, the famous 7th, held the extreme south. The other 2 were in close support in the north, with the 2nd New Zealand Infantry Division alongside. Rommel was full of confidence. He was saying to journalists in Berlin, "You may rely on our holding fast to what we have got. We hold the gateway to Egypt with the full intention to act."
Man kann sich auch verlassen. Was wir haben, halten wir fest.
Hitler was experiencing one of his historic intuitions. He saw before him the destined conqueror of Egypt, and on him he bestowed the baton of Field Marshal. Rommel hoped that if we attacked first, we should strike at his center. That hope we deliberately encouraged by the disposition of our forces. Having allowed our armor to break through, he saw himself destroying it by attacks from both flanks. That done, his own offensive would be launched. General Alexander, Admiral Harwood, and Air Marshal Tedder planned El Alamein together. It was to be a joint operation. Unity of command had become a reality. In the desert itself, General Montgomery and Air Vice Marshal Cunningham lived cheek by jowl. There was no divided command, said General Montgomery. There was only one command. General Montgomery, realizing that a citizen army fights best when it knows exactly what's going on and what it is going to do, saw to it that the plan of battle was known to everybody, from general to private soldier. And it came down from one rank to another till the chain was complete, so that senior officers fighting in their 3rd desert winter shared the knowledge with troopers going into action for the first time. The battle was against fixed lines. And against fixed lines, General Alexander said, the tactics are just like breaking down a wall with a crowbar. You drive it in as far as possible, and then lever this way and that to make a small hole. Then you enlarge it. As soon as you have made a hole large enough, your armored divisions go through to wreck the enemy's artillery and lines of communication. As for General Montgomery, he said his intention was to hit the enemy for 6 right out of Africa. The final preparations began. And now that all knew what was to be done, and all was made ready, there were final moments of normal desert life, of rest, of washing clothes, of a swim in the sea for those near the coast, of cooking the evening meal. The coming of dawn over the Mediterranean, the sunset with a touch of green in the horizon, the mirage turning sand into water and sprinkling that water with the sails of small ships. Many a soldier saw these things, perhaps for the first time, and he wrote his letters home and smoked and talked things over, or lay silent as he listened to the pipes playing Highland Laddie. The Battle of El Alamein began in the evening. As light failed, the final moves were made. The Eighth Army watched Rommel's lines, lying in moonlight and shadow.
By early morning, the first objectives were in our hands. The barrage had done its work. The guns had been heard in Alexandria, 60 miles away. The enemy had been taken partly by surprise. Our infantry took some prisoners in their pajamas. But elsewhere, fighting was severe. There was a good deal of bayonet work. Now our forces moved up, consolidating and advancing further. Infantry, tanks, and air force working as one. After a hard day's fighting, the 8th Army had made a salient in the north 6 miles wide and to a depth 4 miles beyond the first enemy minefield. Next day, attacks were made in the center and south, the attacks that Rommel had been expecting and which he thought were the real thing, but they were merely diversions. In fact, our main attack was to be in the north. The 8th Army's crowbar had been driven in and was being levered this way and that. our salient, the Australians were attacking again and secured a 3-mile front running west-northwest. Rommel counterattacked repeatedly during these days, both on the ground and in the air. The Air Force was doing a magnificent job. For the Luftwaffe, the skies became a place of deadly peril, and the machines that escaped us there were destroyed on the ground. On the 4th day of the battle, Kidney Ridge was assaulted by troops of the 7th Armored Division, riflemen, light tanks, and armored cars. The ridge was taken. In the meantime, the Australians, backed by British tanks, were exploiting their former northward thrust and driving a wedge still further into the German forces near the sea. was now fighting back with little pause and with increasing desperation. Days' bitter work cut off large numbers of Rommel's infantry, some of whom, for the time being, fought on isolated. Casualties suffered were heavy on both sides, but large groups of prisoners were in our hands. While the battle in the north was raging, Rommel had been forced to act. We had imposed our will on him. He moved 2 panzer divisions, the 21st and Ariete, from the south to just below our salient. The Air Force began the task of preventing them from concentrating. General Mongomery now gathered his entire armor, including his division from the south, ready for the crowbar's final thrust. The first phase was finished. On November the 1st, the 9th day of battle, the 8th Army advanced on its entire front of 40 miles. But the blow we meant to be mortal was struck at the head of the bulge. Was the breakthrough. Within 2 hours, our light tanks were 40 miles behind Rommel's lines, destroying his transport. The result was consternation and chaos. The moment that Alexander and Montgomery had been waiting for had come. The entire weight of their armor was in readiness, and like a fleet of ironclads, it sailed through the gap. Its purpose was simple: to destroy Rommel's armor. this day, November the 3rd, the heaviest armored battle of the campaign had been waged. Fighting went on along the whole front, but it was centered on El Alamein, where a tank battle of the bitterest kind reached hour by hour a deeper and more bloody intensity. 3/4 of the Axis tanks were burning or otherwise wrecked. As the day faded, the battle still continued. At El Alamein, we captured the dominating ridge. Our air force had almost annihilated the Luftwaffe, and now our entire strength pounded an enemy beginning to crack.
This is the BBC Home and Forces program. This is Bruce Belfridge. Here's some excellent news which has come during the past hour in the form of a communique from GHQ Cairo. It says, the Axis forces in the Western Desert, after 12 days and nights of ceaseless attacks by our land and air forces, are now in full retreat.
That'll show 'em. There's plenty more where that came from.
The Afrika Corps, utterly broken and possessed with no thought but flight, was hotly pursued. But the 8th Army was not only the thunder behind, but the lightning ahead. From hull-down positions on the road of escape, our guns and tanks knocked out on the first day of retreat over 50 of Rommel's remaining panzers without loss. He had already left 500 tanks behind him on the battlefield. We captured over 1,000 pieces of artillery. Up to 1,000 aircraft, from troop carriers to fighters, were wreckage on the ground. Italians in the south, abandoned by Rommel with neither food nor water, were swept up by us to the tune of 5 divisions. In the north, we took thousands of Germans. Among them were von Thoma, commander of the Afrika Corps, Burckhardt, leader of the German parachutists, and 8 Italian generals. We buried 20,000 enemy dead, but in rendering our own dead the same final duty, great care had to be used. For the Germans, on several occasions, had attached booby traps to our men's bodies. Pursuit was remorseless. Every enemy column, on the coast road or in the desert, sometimes jammed head to tail, was bombed, blasted and machine-gunned. They tasted what they'd administered in France and Poland. Forces on the ground had crushed Rommel's flimsy rearguard and were sweeping on. After 2 days' pursuit, rain fell, and the chase was much impeded. Stretches of road turned to shallow streams. Aircraft landing grounds were waterlogged. Despite the rains, however, On the fourth day, we had taken, after a brief fight, Mersa-Matruh, the first of the newly captured ports the Navy used to bring up supplies. The first heavily mined roads were encountered at Hellfire Pass, where the twisting road rises 700 feet. From then onwards to Benghazi, 450 miles further west, every pass had been blown by the enemy, and every mile of road had to be examined and cleared of mines and obstructions. The engineers worked night and day. To Saloum, the Navy brought 1.5 million gallons of water and other vital supplies. By the 8th day, the enemy had been cleared out of Egypt. Tobruk, whose name is written deep in our Middle East campaigns, Tobruk, which we held as a fortress behind the enemy lines for 9 months and which had already changed hands twice, was ours once more. The date was November the 13th. In Cyrene, the 8th Army passed from desert to a green countryside, which its Italian colonists had abandoned, and it was no more than a week between our taking Tobruk and entering Benghazi. At Benghazi we paused to replenish our supplies. The harbor, bombed by us for over 2 years, so regularly that the pilots called it doing the mail run, was now littered with sunken ships. Cranes, installations, and most of the quays were demolished. Yet the Navy and engineers worked to such good purpose that before long our ships were unloading. By sea and land, we were soon bringing up 3 million gallons of petrol a week and 8,000 tons of ammunition. While we'd been building up our strength, Rommel had been digging in at El Alamein. But after remaining 3 weeks preparing to fight, he changed his mind and withdrew as soon as he felt the full weight of our attack. His indecision achieved nothing except to intensify our new onslaught. From El Alamein to Tripoli is 530 miles. It took the 8th Army 41 days to accomplish it. During that time, they fought several actions with Rommel's rearguards, putting down on one occasion a barrage rivaling that of El Alamein. But though we were delayed, our onward sweep was never in doubt. Just before the last stage began, General Mongomery said in an order of the day, "Nothing has stopped us since the Battle of Egypt began. Nothing will stop us now." And nothing did. 8 days later, we were fighting on the outskirts of Tripoli itself. The surrender of Tripoli by the governor of Libya and the mayor of the city extinguished the Italian overseas empire. Country by country, the British Army had conquered it. Abyssinia, Eritrea, Italian Somaliland, Libya, Tripolitania. Not a single town now remained to them. In 80 days, the 8th Army had advanced close on 1,400 miles, a feat unparalleled in military history. Throughout the battle and advance, for every casualty suffered, it had inflicted 5 on the enemy. In the words of Mr. Churchill, "You have altered the face of the war in the most remarkable way." What this must have meant in care and organization of the whole movement and maneuvers, what it must have meant in the endurance, tireless endurance and self-denial of the troops, and in the fearless leadership in action, can only be appreciated by those who are actually on the spot. But I must tell you that your fame, the fame of the Desert Army, has spread throughout the world.
Like many a town or village along the coast of Italy, this small fishing town and vacation spot has an ancient heritage. Its roots reach back into the worldly glory of the Roman Empire. It was then, as it is now, a minor port facing out onto the Tyrrhenian Sea. In ancient times, its name was Antium, and it was not without a degree of dubious distinction. Nero was born here, and Caligula. There is little today to recall the days of the Roman legions, and very few of the thousands of Americans who knew it during World War II would recognize its ancient name or its rebuilt, unscarred face. Time and peace have had nearly 2 decades to do their healing work. There has been peace, and much that is past has been mercifully lost to memory. great many Americans will never forget this town's modern-day name, the name they knew it by in 1944, Anzio.
In 1943, it was one of our strategic aims to draw as many German forces as possible away from the Russian front and French coastal areas and to contain them on the Italian peninsula while liberating as much of Italy as might be possible with the means at our disposal.
As General Clark was well aware, our objectives were one thing, the achieving of them another. In late 1943, our lack of progress in the south of Italy was leading to the necessity of a landing in the enemy's rear at Anzio. Our problems in Italy had been many. For example, there was the terrain. It was ideal for the defending enemy forces, cruelly difficult for Allied troops.
Oh boy, you talk about your bad country. I mean, they didn't have but two directions over there. Up the hill and down the hill.
Here, methods of transport long obsolete became operational necessities. It was this kind of hostile, perpendicular country which led one Allied officer to comment, "What you need to fight a war over this ground is an army of bulletproof kangaroos." The kangaroos, to be effective, would have had to be amphibious as well as bulletproof, for uncrossable rivers and blown bridges were prime facts of life.
Ah, the enemy really knew his job. When those people blew a bridge, we had to start over from scratch. Some of our guys stayed wet so long their skin puckered up like a prune. We didn't get a lot of help from the weather either, as I remember.
By midwinter, the Allies' advance toward Rome had bogged down. Just south of Cassino, a stalemate had developed, and it was the deadlock here at the Gustav line which germinated the seeds of the Anzio operation. Naples, mid-January 1944. The build-up for a landing at Anzio was underway. This would be an amphibious end run, which would put a force on the beach to the enemy's rear and much too close to Rome for his comfort. Maybe we could break the Cassino deadlock this way, but from the start, there were serious problems.
It had the looks of a very chancy operation. For one thing, when all the begging, borrowing, and scrounging were done, there were only 38 LSTs for the sea lift. What that meant was the initial landing force was going to have to be dangerously small. 2 divisions. 2 more to come on the second trip. 6th Corps, that was us, under General John P. Lucas, drew the honor. It was a gamble for everybody concerned, but it had to be taken.
By 21 January 1944, the task force was moving toward Anzio. The 2 divisions were well chosen. The British 1st Infantry had been through Dunkirk, the American 3rd had fought through Tunisia and Sicily. But at this point, all was doubt. Speculation. What lay ahead, no man, at whatever level, could know for certain.
By the time it got light on the 22nd, we were already putting people on the beach. I made the Salerno landing before, and I was all set in my mind for this to be just as bad. I kept waiting for them to open up with the heavy stuff, but it didn't happen. I didn't get it. sure wasn't complete.
Unbelievably, the landing was almost completely unopposed. The enemy's reserve divisions near Rome had been drawn south by an Allied attack on the Casino front designed to do just that. By an ironic bit of timing, the Germans had called off their 24-hour coast watch on the very night when the task force was approaching Anzio. Equally ironic was this: we had achieved complete surprise, and we didn't know it.
The only real trouble we got that day was from the air. They did some damage, but they only had something like 350 planes in the whole area. We had about 2,000, so they couldn't do too much. Still, at the time, it seemed like enough.
Despite harassment from the air, losses were light. The first day saw 90% of the landing forces ashore. Immediately, they began consolidating the beachhead against the enemy counterattack, expected at any moment. With his reserve divisions pulled south by the Casino attack, the enemy had only ragtag fragments of units at his disposal, but he moved them up swiftly. Prisoners taken in the first days were universally smiling and confident once they discovered they were not going to be mistreated. They were certain that in a matter of days they would see the Allied landing force pushed into the sea. The 6th Corps had already faced the swift and professional reaction of the German commander Kesselring at Salerno, and expected no less of him in this new meeting. He lost no time in eliminating the advantage of surprise which the Allies had unknowingly gained. At Kesselring's command, General von Mackensen assumed responsibility for Anzio, and by evening of the second day of the landing, parts of 8 divisions were in position and more were moving up. Beginning at dawn, 4 days after the first landing, the Allied force set out to push farther inland, enlarging the beachhead. The golden moment of surprise was gone. They came against rigid opposition. It was a foretaste of things to come. In 3 days of fighting, the perimeter was extended somewhat, but the cost was high. A force of 767 American Rangers trying to infiltrate and capture nearby Cisterna was ambushed. Most were taken prisoner. By now, the other 2 divisions of the 6th Corps had arrived, but so had the enemy.
It was one of my duties as a medical officer to keep a listing of casualties for Corps headquarters. By the end of January, we had taken a total of 3,000 casualties. As a statistic, that's a straightforward figure. The mind may accept it without distress. The thing that must be remembered is this. The statistic refers to 30 times 100 human beings hurt or killed.
The Allied offensive ground to a stop, and the Anzio forces went on the defensive. Bad weather came. This meant no air cover. This meant enemy forces building up without hindrance. A counterattack was inevitable, and we got ready for it. But barbed wire and mines, so helpful to a force on the defensive, were in somewhat short supply. The enemy intended now to make another Dunkirk of Anzio. Swiftly, he shifted forces from northern Italy, southern France, and even the Balkans. Daily, his fighting machine was growing stronger on the ground, as casualties drew the Allied forces thinner. By mid-February, the enemy had pushed the Allies back in the center of the grimly held beachhead, almost to the last ditch lines of defense. The outlook, depending on which side you were looking from, was excitingly bright or very dark. Now, once again, an Allied attempt in the south to breach the Gustav line failed. The men on the ground didn't know that the breakthrough attempt was also intended to ease the pressure on the Anzio perimeter. They only knew that enemy guns still looked down their necks from the fortified heights and that advance became impossible. With the repulse of the Second Cassino offensive, it became clear. Anzio was on its own. The crisis was here. Every resource was marshaled to meet it. When the massive frontal attacks came, we met them with a hurricane of fire. Heavy and well-directed naval gunfire played an important part in holding back the enemy tide. The Anzio front was so close to the sea that naval guns became infantry support weapons. Explosives proved the saving factor. Artillery, naval shelling, and ton after ton of bombs. Limited by Hitler's personal plan to a narrow front, the enemy force was doomed to spend itself against a solid wall of explosives. Having weathered the crisis, the 6th Corps' commander, General Lucas, received a new assignment, Assistant Commander, 5th Army. The new commander of the Anzio force was General Lucien K. Truscott, recently appointed deputy to General Lucas and former commander of the 3rd Division. What lay ahead was now up to him. This was the situation the new commander faced. He held a beachhead, but a smaller one. In the center, an ugly bulge remained, and there it stayed. The simple fact was, neither side had strength to do anything about it. Now came a strange 3-month period which no one who was there will forget. The static war at Anzio, or as some called it, the Sitzkrieg.
By now, everybody was used to living in holes. Anyway, as used to it as you can get. When we could, we put in the time on improvements. We used to say we had all the comforts of home, provided you lived in a muddy hole in the ground back home.
Within the reduced area of the beachhead, there was now no corner which was out of range of enemy artillery. Like industrious moles, the Anzio forces in the field moved themselves underground.
We struck it lucky. A cosy bit of a cave it was, no digging necessary. It was already occupied, as you might say, but we got on fine with the former tenants because they were very quiet. I wrote the missus not to worry about me. I was spending all my spare moments in the ruddy museum. Still, it wasn't all the cook's to her. There was always work to be done.
There was work, plenty. Daily, nightly, endlessly, there was the exchange of shells of varying sizes, weights, and types, fired out from and into the battered beachhead.
I don't know. Sometimes you gotta get a different slant before you really see a thing. Like, you know what I mean. I heard the guns going every night. Sure, but till I got on this brass salvage detail one day, it never really hit me how much of what was going on was going on. It made you wonder how there was any mountains left, much less, little stuff like houses and people. I tell you, you should have seen all that brass.
It was during this period that Anzio Annie became especially well known, though not popular among the inhabitants of the beachhead. Actually, Anzio Annie was not one, but 2 huge German railway guns, called Robert and Leopold by the men who directed their fire into every corner of the crowded perimeter.
There were no rear areas at Anzio. Wherever you were, if you were above ground, you could be reached by artillery. That's why you could find a strange pipe sticking about at the driveway of an Italian villa. A breather pipe, an air vent. And with the aid of the Corps of Engineers, our headquarters at Anzio went underground. The main corridor gave you an idea of how big this specialized foxhole was. It ran just about a quarter of a mile in a straight line. Branching off from it, all the elements of an operating headquarters. Everything needed, underground. Railway tunnels, natural caves, all were put to use and glad to get them. What with bad weather, shellings, and air raids, there was a lot to be said for underground living at Anzio.
Another constant reality of the beachhead was the endless patrolling, probing, raiding.
Mostly we went at night, but sometimes it'd be a daylight raid. Maybe some enemy people would sneak in and set up observation in some house. Then a raiding party would go in and take them out. It was a regular thing. You didn't get used to it, but at least you got where you understood what you were doing. If you were lucky, you came back with everybody on their feet. If there was a good part, that was it, when everybody came back standing up.
There was a right funny side to it all, though. These propaganda sheets we used to get were always good for a chuckle. I don't know yet what they hope to accomplish. As time went on, there were days when it seemed like it was my dad's war all over again. Trenches, no man's land and all that. Quite often in the day, things would be so quiet you could hear small, distant sounds across the field. Mind you, though, night time was something else again. One night, in the bay, an ammunition ship was hit. It was like a great big fireworks display. It wasn't good to think of the people who'd been on it.
After our field hospital had been bombed and shelled a few times, we decided to take steps. We couldn't go entirely underground, so we did the next best thing and built strong revetments into which the tents could be put. We nurses helped where we could. It was a huge job, but it was necessary. We'd been shelled so often, we came to be called Hell's Half-Acre. In fact, some line soldiers would actually hide small wounds, rather than risk being sent over here. I'm not making this up. It actually happened.
Strange things happened on occasion. There was the teenage German lad we found trying to get among the ships with a one-man submarine device. He seemed much too young to be out on such business.
They sent some men round to where the thing was beached to bring it in. Funny-looking thing. Really not much more than one torpedo to ride on and another one underneath to shoot. Ruddy propellers started up when they started to tow it. Livened up their afternoon all right. Well, there were some jolly good sprinters among them lads. In the end, nothing happened at all. The thing simply stopped again. Sorry to present you with an anticlimax, but you know what? It happened in the middle of a time which was very much like that.
As spring approached, Anzio was the scene of massive buildup for the breakout which would have to come. Despite harassing fire, the unloading of ships went on. There was a moment when there were so many supplies on the beach that this little Italian fishing port rated 7th among the great ports of the world. Now the static war at Anzio was approaching its end. Commanders were formulating the plans which would break the Anzio forces out and set them on the road to Rome. As spring came on, there were special classes in the care and use of specialized items of destruction. Rehearsal for the real thing. Near Anzio, a group of American commanders gathered to witness a demonstration. The 3rd Division Commander, General Iron Mike O'Daniel, gave a graphic description to General Clark. As well he might, since it was a device of his own inventing which the officers had come to see.
The old man called it a battle sled, and that was pretty accurate. All it was, you had a bunch of foxholes, only they were steel, and rigged up for towing behind a tank. That way, a squad of guys could stay in their holes for cover and move up at the same time. It's pretty neat. It never caught on, but in my book, it was a good idea.
In the south, the Allied strength had grown. It was now possible to mount an all-out push against the Gustav line.
It came pretty early, a feeling that this time we were going to make it. Don't ask me where we got the idea, because it was still us on the low ground and them on the high. The terrain hadn't gotten any better. Their aim hadn't gotten any worse. Just the same, the feeling was there. This time, we were going to make it.
After a week of heavy fighting, it was clear that the forces in the south were, in fact, breaking through the unbreakable Gustav line. The time for a coordinated breakout from Anzio was here. May 23rd, 1944, the Anzio breakout begins. The days of the Sitzkrieg at Anzio are at an end, and the days of the beachhead itself nearly so.
Over grounds where both sides had been planning all sorts of little surprises for each other. You had to take it slow and watch your step. So it started slow, but at least we were moving at last. Now, after everything, here was the road to Rome.
By June 4th, 1944, American troops were entering Rome. Behind lay an action over which historians could and would widely disagree in years to come. On the battered beachhead, our men had learned much. And perhaps the enemy had learned something too. He had done his best and his worst against the Americans and British at Anzio. And it had not been enough.